Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the session 6 of the 21st Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. NWIL's land acknowledgement is read at our opening and closing sessions. To view the land acknowledgement, please visit our website in the land acknowledgement tab. The link will be added to the Whova chat for you. Today is September 14th. This session is titled Adventures in eBook Lending, presented by Mark Hofeditz. My name is Libby, and I am the convener for this session. This session is being recorded with permission from the presenters. Because they retain the copyright to the information they are presenting, they may choose to request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to the NWIL committee chairperson. However, at this time, it is planned that the recordings will be made available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn live captioning on, click the CC link at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitle. If you have a question during this session, please use the Q&A function in Whova, and I will pose these to the presenter at the end of their presentation. When the presentation ends, please complete the post-session survey in Whova, located on the conference homepage. We will also be dropping that link in the chat. NWIL and presenters appreciate and use your feedback. On that note, I hand this over to Mark.
Thank you so much, Libby, and thank you everyone for joining me this morning, afternoon. I'm over in Boston, so wherever you are, whatever time you are joining us, welcome. So as Libby mentioned, this presentation is titled Adventures in eBook Lending, Challenges and Opportunities for Implementation. My name is Mark Hofeditz. I use the he series of pronouns, and I'm very excited to be talking with you all today about this. A brief presentation overview. First, I'm going to discuss a little bit of the background that led us to explore eBook lending. Then I will go through the ins and outs of our eBook lending journey, and I use the word journey very specifically here because there were lots of ups and downs throughout the process. And then finally, I want to leave you with some tangible things that you can take to your library if you are interested or considering implementing eBook lending as part of your ILL or resource sharing services. But before that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background information about myself. So like I said, my name is Mark Hofeditz, and I currently work as the library coordinator at the Ginn Library at Tufts University. As library coordinator, I help assist the oversight of the Access Services Department, which, as you can see from the picture, deals with circulation, reserves, and surprise, surprise, interlibrary loan. I've now been working in academic libraries for about 9 years, and I started in my graduate program in my grad library at the Boston Conservatory, where I was studying music composition. So my background is actually in music. I primarily like to write in vocal genres. I'm a fan of writing operas. My last work was about two women who met on a dating app and then decided to get married in Las Vegas. So open to interesting and different concepts for opera. However, I've been taking a bit of a break from writing because I'm currently an MLIS student at the San Jose State University's iSchool. And I saw that there were actually quite a number of us who were graduates or are attending SJSU. So just want to give a brief shout out to all of them, and also to shout out to anybody who is currently working full-time and also being a part-time student, because it is a lot of work. So some background information to share a little bit more about the university I currently work at, which is Tufts University. There are 4 main campuses, 2 that are located in Boston. One is in Medford, and that's the one I currently work at. And there's also one out in Grafton, which is kind of a little bit west of the city, closer to Worcester, if you're familiar with the geography of Massachusetts. And across those 4 campuses, there are 6 different libraries. The Ginn Library, as I mentioned, is the one that I work at, and that primarily serves the Fletcher School, which is a school graduate program for global affairs. And I'll also mention that Tufts University is a member of the Boston Library Consortium, which is a really fantastic nonprofit organization that builds community of interests and a bunch of different, provides a bunch of different service agreements across universities in New England. Almost every state in New England has a BLC member institution. I believe Maine is the only state that does not, but they've been such a great partner in resource sharing and interlibrary loan throughout my years at Tufts. And I saw in some of the chats for the 2 previous sessions to this one that there were actually a lot of questions about utilizing controlled digital lending, or CDL, as a mechanism through interlibrary loan. And I highly recommend checking out the work that the BLC is currently doing on this. I was very fortunate to serve on a subgroup that as part of their initiative for this. And they're doing a lot of really interesting, very difficult work to kind of forge a path forward with this. So I really recommend checking out all of the things that they're currently working on. At Tufts University, so as I mentioned, there were 6 different libraries, and as you saw, with a variety of different subject areas. So we actually have 4 different interlibrary loan departments, and we all work rather differently in terms of the different needs of those different student groups. However, we do have something called the Resource Sharing Team, or RST, at Tufts, which consists of members from different libraries and their interlibrary loan departments working together to solve common issues or have discussions on a monthly basis during the academic year. There are a bunch of different teams at Tufts for different areas of librarianship, and we'll get into some of those further into the session. And finally, I'll just mention some of the systems that we use in relation to our interlibrary loan departments. We use ILLiad, but we also use Rapid ILL. We're members of the IDS project. We're OCLC members, and our integrated library system is ALMA, and our primary catalog is Primo. And despite the fact that this presentation primarily focuses on the systems that we use for our ebook lending process, I want to make clear that ebook lending is possible across a variety of different systems. So towards the end of this session, there will be some takeaways of general things that you should be considering if you'd like to implement ebook lending at your library. So in the early stages of this, we had been discussing ebook lending for quite a while, as far back as 2013, which was before I even started at Tufts. And the question that kept coming back was, why now? Well, there are a lot of reasons. COVID forced us to really re-examine and reimagine the role that interlibrary loan can have in helping patrons access their materials. Just because a global pandemic happened and is still ongoing, that doesn't mean people will stop needing access to different materials. And interlibrary loan can really be one of those ways that we can help people out. There's also a major cost saving potential and time saving potential in terms of costs. Sending an electronic file is much more efficient than having to ship things. And also there's a lot of staff time saving potential if we're sending a PDF of a resource instead of having to pull a book from the stacks, process it, ship it, wait for it to go to the library we're lending it to, and so on and so forth. I'll also mention in terms of extended ILL lending capabilities. As during the pandemic, like many places, we were acquiring a lot more electronic resources. And so that means that we now have the opportunity to share some more of those electronic resources than we would have otherwise. Another pandemic specific reason to investigate this was that we were really interested to collaborate more with other Tufts library teams. Having been working at that point, working remote for a year, year and a half, we were really hungry for some inter-library group interaction in trying to make transformative change at Tufts. And finally, the environment just seemed really, really ripe to figure this out and try to understand how we can implement it. 2021 was a really big year for the publishing industry in a lot of interesting ways. In Maryland, they passed an ebook law that required publishers to license ebooks to libraries under quote unquote reasonable terms. And in this past June, unfortunately, in federal court, that was ruled unconstitutional. So the current status, if there's going to be appeal, is still up in the air. But it shows that state governments are really trying to fight against the publishing industry for any price gouging that may be occurring in the pricing structures of individual versus institutional ebook licensing. Additionally, there were congressional hearings in 2021 with the big five publishers about the restrictive nature of their ebook contracts with libraries. And as has been mentioned before, and as you're probably aware, there is an ongoing lawsuit against the Internet Archive and their CDL practices. So there's just a lot going on in the landscape about the different ways that libraries are trying to share their materials. So with all of this kind of background information, we decided to work on a three-phase implementation plan. The first phase deals with information gathering, getting some better understanding about how we can make this a reality. Phase 2 is about making the systems changes and figuring out the workflows that we need to utilize to facilitate ebook lending. And finally, a testing and implementation process to make it all a reality. And with that, let's jump right into phase 1, information gathering. So as a background to this, I want to differentiate between a couple of different types of electronic sharing that exist. And thankfully, I have gone after the two presenters before me, because they did a fantastic job in actually describing some of the other methods of electronic sharing that can happen. So ebook PDF sharing is the system that we are specifically using for our ebook lending processes. And essentially, it's the sharing of a single PDF of a legally acquired electronic resource. This is a one-way transaction, meaning we download the material, we send it to the patron, and they have access to that PDF in perpetuity. They do not have to return it. They really have unlimited access to it. So it is DRM or digital rights management free. And that is allowed through license negotiation that we have with a variety of different publishers. A similar type of ebook sharing is what I call link sharing, and that is along the lines of what the ProQuest pilot is working on. So essentially, you're sharing a link for someone to access a legally required electronic resource. Differently than the PDF model, this allows you to have access to the material for a limited period of time. And similarly, it does require license negotiation with a variety of publishers and vendors to make the process viable. And finally, we'll get into controlled digital lending. I won't go too deep because there are a lot of great presentations about that already today. But in its simplest form that I could figure out how to describe, it's the digitization of a legally acquired print resource, and then you share it electronically with digital rights management. Similarly to the ebook link sharing process, the patron has a limited period of access to the digital resource. And while they have access to that, the physical resource is removed from circulation to ensure that the own to loan ratio is being followed there. Now, the one perk to CDL is that there is no license negotiation required. Because the resource starts as a physical resource, there aren't any licenses attached to a physical resource, only electronic resources. However, because of the unknown legal landscape with CDL at this current moment, it's a bit riskier to engage with CDL. And it really just depends on the interest of your institution's legal counsel if they'd like to pursue something like this. So hopefully this kind of defines the different types of electronic sharing. This is actually a question that came up when we presented this to our Tufts Library Council to better help them understand what are the differences between each, because there was some confusion between isn't CDL ebook lending, and in this case, no, they're actually very, very different things. So in our research, our early research for trying to find existing resources about ebook lending, beyond the two resources that I'm going to share, the landscape was actually fairly desolate and was a little discerning because you know, we'd like to implement this process, but it's a little difficult to find out how we can do so. Thankfully, there were two really fantastic resources that we utilized as kind of the backdrop for this phase of the process. The first comes from the Viva Consortium, and they're a consortium of 70 colleges and universities located in Virginia, which is actually where I grew up. They began ebook lending in 2016 with 4 different contracts, which has now expanded since. So they were working with Brill, Oxford University Press, Taylor and Francis, and Wiley. And some of the great features about the resources that they have is that they have a series of best practices for ebook borrowing and lending. They include the contract license language on their websites. So if you're new to ebook licensing, you can kind of get a better idea of some of the specific clauses that might be used and some of the language for those clauses. And finally, they have a variety of workflow tutorials. They have them for Iliad and Alma, for Tapasa, and also for WorldShare ILO. So we could see a couple of different ways in which the system could facilitate ebook lending. The other resource came from the University of Connecticut, or UConn, which is actually a fellow BLC member library. And they began lending ebooks in 2019 with a broader range of publishers. So they were with Brill, De Gruyter, Edward Elgar, Gale, Sage, Taylor and Francis, and Wiley. And they released a presentation, I believe in March. It was March 9th of 2020. So the world was kind of busy dealing with some other things, and this kind of fell under the cracks a little bit, but I'm really happy to share this resource because it's been so helpful to us. So they had a presentation that primarily focused on licensed language and negotiation, how they used their workflow, which is very similar to some of the systems that we used, Iliad, Rapid, and IDS, and also some challenges and considerations that you need to think about if you're looking to implement ebook lending. So with these 2 resources, we kind of came up with our own strategy. And Tufts really enjoys using acronyms, as you will see throughout this presentation. So there were 3 components to our initial strategy. The first started with our collection steering team, or CST. And their responsibility was going to be reviewing licenses and clarifying language about our interlibrary loaning of the electronic resources that we owned. The resource sharing team, which I was the chair of, or am the chair of, discusses possible workflows and best practices for how to facilitate these types of requests. And finally, with library technology services, we have a representative who also serves on the resource sharing team, and they were responsible for making the different system changes that would help us do the processes for ebook lending. So another way to visualize this was 3 different pieces of the puzzle, all working in tandem to make this a reality. And then we move into phase 2, the planning and preparation. And this is where things started to get rather interesting. And we'll see why in a second. So this is broken down kind of by the different subjects that came up as part of this implementation process. The first of which is license negotiation, which we had originally charged the collection steering team to handle, but actually needed to be handled by the assistant director at Tisch Library, which serves the larger undergrad and graduate populations for art sciences and engineering, and also working with the head of acquisition. So we misunderstood a bit about the control that the collection steering team had in relation to these licenses. As part of those early conversations, the biggest question was, how do we determine which publishers to engage with? Do we go the route of having an understanding of different publishers' general willingness to allow for something like this? Do we base it on the interlibrary loan data? And based on how many holdings we have for different resources? This is actually a route we did take for some of our libraries, but some of the data that is pulled from Iliad is not terribly clean, and it required a lot of data review to ensure that we are actually getting the right information. And there was going to be a lot of variation in terms of the licensing negotiation process. It can take a month, it can take 6 months. It really just depends on the back and forth between your representative who is negotiating the license and your vendor, your contact at a vendor. So those are some of the challenges that we faced in terms of the license negotiation. Another thing that came up along the way was how the license language appears in the library catalog. At this point in our journey, we were primarily looking at the Viva Consortium's workflows, and they involved going into the catalog to download the material. And we wanted to make sure that the licenses, the language in the licenses was clear enough that we, the ILO practitioners, knew what we could and could not do with different resources. So as we explored this, we realized that the language license varied quite a lot in our library catalog. There was confusion about the differences between scholarly sharing and interlibrary loan. Some of the licenses, as they appeared in the catalog, didn't actually specify an ILL clause, which was concerning. And finally, we really just needed a consistent format for all of our licenses, so we, the practitioners, wouldn't have to go digging through mounds and mounds of information to figure out if we are actually able to loan something. So this is when we had to rope in RMRS, the Resource Management and Repository Services Department, which is essentially all of our metadata and cataloging folks. So at the get-go, we've now had to involve the assistant director at one of the libraries who did serve on the collection steering team to be our main negotiator for licenses, and a whole nother department to ensure that the licenses were correctly appearing consistently in the library catalog. In terms of the resource sharing team, the one that I was on, we really focused on the workflow and best practices. And as we did, many questions arose. As I mentioned previously, how do we navigate the different licenses to ensure that we are correctly sharing the right materials? This is a big question that came up. How are the files actually hosted? There is a wide variety of how they are hosted and downloadable depending on who the host or publisher is. So documents might exist as a single PDF. They might exist as a zip file of individual PDFs, or you might just have to download a bunch of individual PDFs, which can get tedious and can really impede the creation of best practices for this type of process. And another question that came up quite a bit was, what's the difference between the publisher hosting it and another resource hosting it, something like an aggregator like EBSCO or ProQuest? And how do we navigate all of those different things that we aren't normally interacting with in terms of our regular ILO processing? And another big thing came up, which was compressing large files. What software or system were we going to use to compress the files and ensure that we could successfully send them through ILLiad? So we had, again, looked at the Viva Consortium for a workflow idea of how we could facilitate this. When we went to test it, we ran into another major roadblock that we hadn't considered, which was that our electronic holdings had not been uploaded to OCLC. Obviously, a very large problem if the patron is unable to specifically request the electronic version of something. So who was going to be responsible for managing the eBook holdings to allow patrons to borrow these things? So instead of utilizing OCLC, we ultimately decided that we are going to upload into different holding profiles our rapid holdings to specify what publishers and ebooks or electronic resources we were able to send. And this was handled by other people that we had not considered at the time, a systems librarian named Henry, who works in LTS, and Lydia, who works in the electronic resource management department. And they have been really fantastic in getting those set up so the process can be facilitated. And in terms of the systems changes that needed to happen within ILLiad, thankfully, this was the drama-free portion of this entire process. So we basically created an ebook item type and also an ebook queue called awaiting ebook request processing. And as we've gone through this process, we've realized that we're actually going to start using more of Yukon's process because we have similar systems that we're using, and also the process is a bit more integrated. There are a few less steps. So in this case, what Heather, our RTS, LTS representative, is working on is figuring out a way with IDS to input the Primo link or our library catalog link directly into the call number field. So this way, once we open the awaiting ebook request processing queue, we can then just copy and paste the link into a browser, download the resource from there, and then send it off to the patron, trying to eliminate as many complicated steps as possible. I will note that there is a Primo add-on for Iliad that we do, some of us do use. However, it's primarily used more for searching than it is for downloading. There is a very annoying workaround for it, but I won't get into those details at this point. So the original expectation for this process was a very neat three-pronged approach with the collection steering team, resource sharing team, and our representative for both the resource sharing team and library technology services, when in reality, it involved far more players than we had anticipated. And ultimately, this was a good thing because it ensured that the process was going to be sustainable and that we weren't trying to manage everything within the interlibrary loan department because we couldn't have done all of those specific things. So we then move on to phase 3. And this is actually the process that we are going to be jumping into this fall. When I submitted this presentation originally, we were hoping to do some testing during the summer. However, the resource sharing team takes a break during the summer most of the time. And there were still quite a few hangovers from some of the processes that I had previously mentioned that needed to be hammered out before we could actually really test this in our system. So I am very excited in the future to potentially have the sequel to Adventures in eBook lending and talk more about all of what comes out of phase 3. And with that, I want to leave you all with some very tangible takeaways for this session in 6 general areas, some of which I covered and some which kind of act as an overview of all of the different areas that we've talked about thus far. The first is license negotiation. So these are questions to pose to you or to whoever in your library environment may be responsible for these sorts of things. Who is responsible for negotiating the ebook licenses? How do you figure out which publishers you're actually going to engage in this process? And how long is the negotiation process going to take? Like I said earlier, it can be very, very quick. It can be very, very prolonged. But as long as both sides are going with good faith, it should be a relatively stress-free process. Next, talking about the ILL workflow. How can the system that you're currently using best accommodate ebook lending? Like I said, ebook lending is probably possible amongst a variety of different systems, even if you're not using Iliad. It's just about figuring out the different internal workings and external workings with your processes and best practices to make sure that this can work. Next, we have ILL software modifications, and it's important to make sure that you note who is responsible for actually making these alterations. Is it someone in your interlibrary loan department? Is it someone in a library tech department or a systems librarian? And then what are the changes that you're going to be making to the software to support your workflow and systems? And given the rapid change that is happening in the interlibrary loan sphere with different software systems, it's important to consider how frequently you might have to make changes to your systems to continue to facilitate ebook lending. In terms of license visibility, which may not apply to every library depending on your system, but again, hitting home, who is a stakeholder for managing your license templates in your library catalog? And what are the specific terms that you're going to display in the catalog that are most pertinent to both your users and your staff, because outside of the interlibrary loan staff, other users may want to know the ways in which they can and cannot use an electronic resource. And finally, or not finally, next to last, ebook holdings. Who is responsible for managing your electronic holdings? How are they going to be hosted? Are they going to be through a Rapids holding profile? Will they be done through OCLC? Really important to consider. And as your folks are working through this, it's important to figure out the terms that you need to identify for the lendable titles. It may be the publisher specifically, but sometimes that may get a little harried if you're working with publishers that have EBA or DDA programs, because you really only want to be, or they will most likely only want to be sharing the resources that the library owns and not is currently has access to, but may not in further perpetuity. And then some general considerations. Again, I've been hitting this home. It's important to figure out your stakeholders from the very, very beginning to make sure that the process is fully facilitated well. And then how do you plan this process and execute it when there are so many different moving pieces? How much flex time can you really build into your schedule to make sure that this is done successfully? And then ultimately, how sustainable is this process going to be? If you're working across a multitude of different departments, you have to take into their consideration their needs and their workflows that they have going on throughout the year. If you're working in a smaller department, is it easier in that instance because you have a couple of less stakeholders that you need to be interacting with? So lots of questions, but I hope these are tangible questions that can help out anybody who wants to make ebook lending a reality in their library. So going through all the ups and downs of this, I posed the question to you, was this really worth all the trouble? And to me, the answer is absolutely yes. We do not know when the next pandemic is going to happen. We are currently still living through one. And that doesn't mean people aren't going to need access to materials. And we don't know what format they're going to need, but opening the door to sharing more of our electronic resources is only going to help patrons across the globe in getting the information that they need. Also, the more that we are able to lend ebooks opens up the door for us to borrow ebooks. This is something that has definitely shot up in our department. Requests from our patrons for electronic resources for different ebooks. It doesn't always mean that the publisher is going to allow or have available a version that we can purchase electronically, but this does open the door a bit more to that. Also considering, as I mentioned earlier, that the publishing landscape is shifting, it's really important that we try to both work with publishers and hold them accountable to ensure that libraries are not being gouged for trying to access these electronic resources with our communities. And finally, I really believe that ebook lending can be a very small way to continually transform or make transformative interlibrary loan and resource sharing in whatever capacity it may exist at your university or college or school. Here is a list of all my references and resources, some of which I did mention during the presentation and others which I just thought were kind of interesting to peek into to fully understand the landscape of everything that I discussed today. And with that, I want to end with a couple of thank yous. First and foremost to the Northwest Interlibrary Loan Conference for letting me talk to you all today. This is my first conference as a library professional, and I'm very excited. And I need to send a couple of thank yous to the folks at Tufts who have been so instrumental in making this process happen. First to Martha for negotiating all of our licenses, and to Gwen for being there for all the acquisition related questions that I had, to Henry and Lydia for working to set up our rapid ebook holding profiles. Thank you for jumping into this project when you didn't expect it. It's so appreciated. To all the folks at RMRS for your work in making sure that the licenses are clear and consistent throughout the catalog. To Heather, our LTS RTS representative, for answering all of my annoying questions and just being a bedrock for the resource sharing team. And finally, to the resource sharing team for deciding to jump into the fray and make this a reality for the folks at Tufts. And with that, I would like to open the floor and invite any questions you might have.
Mark, we do have several questions in the Q of A, and I
Great.
will read them for you.
Thank you.
How, and it's in all caps, how did you talk publishers into letting you share PDFs of whole books with your patrons with no limits?
That is a great question. So because I was not the person doing the negotiations, I can't give as much of an inside baseball answer to this. But I think you would be surprised at the willingness of publishers that are open to sharing of ebook PDFs. From some of the resources that I listed in the references and resources, the work that Michael Rodriguez has done has been really important about the negotiation process, and I really recommend checking that out. But some of the things that he's mentioned is to note to the publishers that, just because we are allowing the sharing of an electronic resource doesn't mean that 10,000 people are then automatically going to want that resource. In this case, depending on the publisher, it might be like a very highly academic resource. So it may have more of a niche use. So I think as you can emphasize that it won't negatively impact the publisher's baseline with their finances, that is one method of many negotiation tactics you can use when you're working through those processes.
All right. Another question is, can you show us an example of what that language on the records look? I believe it should be looks like.
So I'd have to go and find, I'm assuming this is about the license language in the library catalog, yes?
I would assume, yes.
Yeah, sure. So if you want to email me after this, I would be happy to give you kind of a viewpoint of some of those different things. I'm hesitant to pull them up right now because I don't have them on hand and I don't have the titles, so I'd have to pull them up. But please send me an email, and I'd be happy to share those with you.
I will be sure to pass that on to the person who asked the question.
Thank you.
Next question. Can you renegotiate your license at any time, or does it have to be done at renewal?
That's a good question. From what I understand, it really depends on the publisher. Again, I'm not the person who's responsible for that renegotiation. Some of them have been open to doing it whenever, but others, when we've reached out saying, hey, we're interested in this, they say, well, you don't have any ebooks that you have available to lend in the current license. So it really just depends.
Thank you. Next question. Is there a way to show or see holdings that allow ebook lending? I know some patrons have issues in thinking seeing items in WorldCat means it's available.
Yes. So I do not have that on me, but again, shoot me an email after this. Because I'm not a systems librarian, I don't have the access in our system to those things. But if I am able to share like a visual of that, I'm happy to reach out to the folks that are part of this process and share that along with you.
Again, I'll pass on that information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question. Are all the publishers and materials that are available for ebook lending academic? Or do you also have other items such as novels and cookbooks, movies available?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record for saying it depends, but it really depends on what the publisher is that you're negotiating with. The ones that we have primarily focused on were more on the academic side, but again, I don't know the full catalog of what the publishers have available. So it really depends on which publishers you would negotiate with and what the different types of materials that they have on. So I'm sorry, I can't give a more specific answer to that question, but it is a good question.
Okay. And then we just have a lovely comment. This has been such an informative session and appreciate that you shared the roadblocks and the solutions. So valuable. So a little feedback there for you.
Thank you. And I just want to say, this is a big reason why I wanted to talk about this. I feel like we have to talk about the things that didn't work as much as we have to talk about the things that do work to move this and other library processes forward. So thank you.
And Mark, I don't know whether you can see the Whova Q&A at all, but somebody posted, is this the presentation you were referring to? And they did one that's open comments from Yukon.
Yes,
Is that
is
one?
in,
okay.
Correct. That is in my in the references
then.
and resources. Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Let me just take a look. Is there any more questions? I believe that's all we have. Let me just see. I'm just seeing a lot of gratitude for a great session. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to fill out the post-session survey. There's a link up in the chat. There's also a link on the Whova page for this. And if anybody has any comments, please toss it in the Q&A or the chat. I believe we have all the questions answered. If I missed one, do let me know.
And again, please feel free to email me. I am a huge nerd and I love talking about this. So I'd be more than happy to connect off of the session.
Okay, well, it's a little bit early, but I am checking with my co-host, but I believe we can end a little bit early today. If nobody has anything else. Let me
Yeah,
see if a new question came in. Hold on.
yeah,
Sorry,
there's
go
no,
ahead.
I was gonna say there's no rule that says we can't end a little early. It's
Ah,
actually a nice little extra because we always end a little
yes.
bit late. We've we've we're doing pretty well there. It just means we get a few extra minutes to run to the bathroom, grab a drink of water for
Yes.
our last session before lunch.
Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thanks,
Don't forget to
everybody.
fill out the survey.